I found this rather nice banner to put above our picture today to show how amazing it is that Judy is back and walking with a single stick up 2 flights of stairs. I just think it's ridiculous. But I'll let her talk to you in just a moment. Right. We're recording. I shall just change seats and let Judy in. This is Judy Stevens, who's walking with great ease. What do you?
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Lovely to see everybody. Before we start the talk, I just want to express my very great thanks to all of you for the gifts. I think you saw the picture of me with the huge box of chocolates.
With hardly any left.
There are none left. And the lovely flowers. And I do thank you very, very much indeed. That was a lovely surprise. My family were totally impressed by the size of the chocolate box. They couldn't believe it. It's the size of a coffee table with a sort of central hole, honestly. And I don't want to part with it. I keep showing it to people. They've never seen such a big box of chocolates in their whole lives. And they're very impressed. And I've been advertising U3A and say how lovely you all are, and do a bit of advertising for the U3A. Thank you for your cards and your encouragement. Thank you very much indeed. I'm feeling quite emotional actually just saying that to you, but I am very, very grateful. I haven't taken it for granted. And I've made a good recovery, thanks to a very good surgeon at the Woodlands at the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital. He was aided by a robot, and he sort of teased me afterwards and said, "Oh, I just sat there and watched the robot do it all." And I said, if you'd mentioned that before, I perhaps would have cancelled. And then he said, "No, I'm only joking. The robot does the measuring. It's a sort of comparatively new technique. And in terms of accuracy, apparently it is very, very successful. And I can confirm that. I made a good recovery. And they said, "Can you do stairs? Can you get dressed? Can you walk about?" Yes. "Can you put trousers on?" Yes. I passed all these tests, and so I spent 3 nights in hospital and then came home and new woman with a new hip. So yeah, it has been successful thanks to the skill of the surgeon and the lovely care that I had in Woodlands. So the conversion of Anglo-Saxon Britain, saints and missionaries, and Martin's put on the front, who were the movers and shakers. So we said we would concentrate on personalities and also remembering what we learned at school, because we did learn that in that way, many of us. Some people didn't do formal history. I do realise that now. A lot of people say they didn't have what I call proper history lessons. But for those of us who did, some of this will seem familiar, but perhaps we're going to go into a bit more detail than was possible when we were pupils. So first of all, the Celtic Church. It probably wasn't made totally clear when you were at school that there were sort of 2 forms of Christianity, 2 types of missionaries working in this country to convert the heathen Anglo-Saxons. Christianity, as you probably know, was established when the Romans were in charge. And Martin's found a really lovely illustration of that, the Chi-Rho fresco from Lullingston Villa. several other villas, of course, have been, well, many villas have been excavated, and there are Christian symbols, either on the frescoes, on walls, or the artifacts that have been discovered in these villas. But often a sort of mixture of Christian symbols and symbols referring to the great Roman gods and goddesses. So we don't know how devout they actually were. It's all a bit of a mystery as to how committed they were to the Christian faith. The jury's still out on that. But certainly Christianity was making headway in this country, and many people probably were committed Christians. And then, of course, the Germanic tribes arrived, who hadn't even heard about Christ, Jesus, and brought their gods and goddesses with them. And again, you might remember this from school, the Celtic monks and missionaries then fled. They moved away to what was called the Celtic fringes, islands and areas that they didn't think the incomers would want because it was poor farming country. So mountainous areas like Wales and places like Cornwall and islands, offshore islands, that's where they went and took refuge. And one of the main differences, important differences between the Roman Christians, say Roman, the ones that were coming from Rome, like St. Augustine, who converted the Kingdom of Kent, as we've already looked at that. The Celtic Church was set up in a very different way, and the Celtic missionaries had a different way of preaching. They were preaching the same knowledge and information. They were preaching Christianity, the theology of Christ, but the setup was different. The organization was very different. So the Celtic monks were dedicated to spreading the word, even though they were living in remote areas. They believed that they must spread the story of Christianity. And at first, it didn't matter that there were two types of Christian organization and two methods of spreading the word. It didn't matter because they weren't in contact with each other. It later became a problem, which we will look at when the two different types encountered each other and were in conflict with each other. And that led to the Synod of Whitby. So Celtic Christianity, how was that different? Well, as we know, St. Augustine was sent by the Pope to convert the heathen in Angleland, landing in Kent and having, it turned out, great success. Then became St. Paulinus, one of Augustine's missionaries, one of his group, was sent up to Northumbria and converted King Edwin. So that was the Roman. They were controlled by the Pope. They were obedient to the Pope's wishes. Certainly in the case of Augustine, he hadn't wanted to come to Angleland, particularly when he reached Gaul. As we said, he heard all these terrible stories about how awful the Angles were, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were, how fierce they were. There was even talk of cannibalism, which was ridiculous. They weren't cannibals at all, but the usual sort of stories that develop, rumors, horrible stories of how fierce the people were, and that the missionaries would be slaughtered on the beach before they'd even got into Kent itself. They would be killed on the beaches. That was what the people had told them, and so they, as you probably remember, they asked permission to turn back. They were so frightened. They were told they got to continue with the mission because they had to be obedient to the Pope. So it wasn't their idea to come there. It wasn't their idea to come to this country at all. Far from it. They were acting in obedience. They were sent. Now the Celtic Church, differently organized from independent, separate monasteries. So the abbot of the monastery was in charge, but not very much in charge. It was very much left to individual missionaries to sort of do their own thing and work out their own area and approach people independently and report back every so often. But it was much more individualistic and free from control. And so we know a lot about the Celtic saints, and they had an individual way of preaching and expressing their Christian faith. And we could say really that they were loners. They were loners, doing their own thing, reporting back to their monastery. But the monastery was their headquarters, their own monastery. Talking of monasteries, I only found out, just a sort of little side, well, just to say something that's not totally relevant, but a little bit. Our daughter's staying with us at the moment while things are all a bit difficult at home. And she was horrified to discover how much my husband and I have sort of hoarded over the, what you call it, hoarding. I just think it's sort of keeping things that are interesting. And she's been going through our cupboards like a thing possessed, saying, why have you still got this? Why have you still got all your university notes? Why have you kept this? This you were using this when I lived at home, and she's 57 now. So she has been doing a sort of huge, she's been on a huge spring cleaning campaign, even though it's not spring anymore, clearing things out. But then ironically, having said, I've got far too many books, I've got to part with them, and merrily throwing books into a dustbin bag, into a black bag, and saying these are too horrible to give to charity, so we'll throw these away. Emptying bookcases like a mad thing. And then ironically bought me a book about the Anglo-Saxons. And in this book, I found two very interesting facts that I will share with you. One, that the word monk comes from the word mono in Latin, meaning single, only, one. Whereas we tend to think that monks worked or lived in a community, that they were part of that community, not independent. And so mono doesn't sound right when we're talking about a monk. So I found that interesting, that originally, and then I remembered that originally monks were like hermits. In the early days of Christianity, in the Middle East, before Christianity had spread, particularly in Egypt, monks were individuals like St. Anthony who went into the desert to pray and to live, and they lived very simply and in a very austere manner. And they were loners. It all came back to me. Mono, one, not living in a community. And then gradually, because they were living such holy lives, living on, well, not very much food, rather like John the Baptist, living on locusts and wild honey, although people must have brought food for John the Baptist, because I don't suppose you could live all that long on locusts and wild honey. Sounds like a starvation diet. And that's what happened with the monks who went to live in Egypt in the desert, partly as an act of penance and partly because they thought that was what God was calling them to do. They attracted followers who admired them, and that then gradually that developed into a community that we call a monastery, and we're more familiar with that. The other thing that this book said in the same sentence was abbot comes from Abba, father. That was never thought about it before. Abbot, father, Abba, as Jesus had said on the cross, Abba. So just sharing that with you, because I found that out last week with this book that, well, this is very ironic. My daughter Catherine throwing books out and sorting out the ones I'm allowed to keep and the ones that she says are not even fit for charity. And then she bought me a new book. which is excellent, a really, really good book on the Anglo-Saxons. So back to the Celtic monks. The same thing happened to them. They were loners in many respects, but they attracted followers, disciples, you might say, who were very admiring of the way they lived. So they were individuals preaching in their own way, walking many, many miles. Most of them were on foot, living off the land as much as possible, sleeping, we'd say, call it sleeping rough, just wrapped up in their, they took a cloak with them and they just wrapped themselves up in a cloak and found some heather and a stone, got a stone, put some heather on it and used that as a pillow, rather like Jacob in the desert in the Old Testament. Not quite sure how they lived, you know, what food they could eat, but you can't live forever on berries and roots and things. Books airily say that, you know, lived on berries and roots. Well, how long would that actually sustain? For how long would that sustain life? It needs to be a bit more carbohydrate. But that was the situation, that the Roman monks, the Roman missionaries, did build monasteries and lived as a community. And the Celtic monks tended to be individuals working for just within their monastery, reporting back to their abbot every so often. We don't even know how often they reported back. Certainly wasn't every day. Absolutely no way. They were working with God's help, inspired by God, and individual. So the first one I've chosen is St. Patrick. Everybody's heard of St. Patrick. Not sure when he was born, but born in Roman Britain. And I think probably do remember, or some of you will remember, he was captured by pirates, Irish pirates, who then took him back to Ireland, where he worked as a slave, tending sheep. And that lasted for 6 years. And then the books all say airily he abandoned paganism and became a Christian, but they don't explain how or who converted him. He escaped from his owners, and following a very powerful dream, a vision we would say, about a liberating sea voyage, he returned to Britain, was reunited with his family, and then had another vision, and that was something else that the Celtic monks specialized in, was having visions, for having almost being able to see into the future, a sort of special gift. We don't think the Roman monks had, but the Celtic monks did, probably because they spent so much time alone. They did have these visions, and these they weren't impulses. They felt they were being led to do things, and they followed that belief that it was God that was telling them what to do. So he had this vision predicting that the Irish people were asking for a Christian mission. He then studied for the priesthood, was ordained, became a bishop, and we've got a date for that, 433 AD. So this is very, very early. And inspirational preaching led to thousands being converted. And again, you may remember being told that he used the shamrock with its 3 leaves to explain to the pagans the doctrine of the Trinity, which is a very hard doctrine for committed Christians to understand. And that's how the shamrock became a sort of an emblem, a symbol of Irish Catholicism and Ireland itself, the shamrock, which was freely available. And so he picked a shamrock leaf and explained about 3 leaves, but forming 3 shapes, but all forming 1 leaf, explained the doctrine of the Trinity to people who otherwise would have found it very bewildering indeed. How could one God have 3 aspects? And he was famously credited with driving the snakes out of Ireland, which is a wonderful legend, but a lot of people think it's true. The fact is that there weren't any snakes in Ireland anyway. There just weren't any snakes, interestingly. So because there weren't any snakes, people put 2 and 2 together and made it 5. And there weren't any snakes because St. Patrick had driven them out because they're evil. They're serpents. So linked with the Bible, linked with the story of Adam and Eve, and also that they bite people and people die. So snakes are bad, and that Patrick had driven them out. I'm going to share a horrible joke with you. When I was told it, I didn't understand it straight away, and I thought I was normally pretty quick on the uptake. My Irish son-in-law told me this joke, and then he had to say it again because he could see that I was looking blank. He said, what did St. Patrick say when he drove the snakes out of Ireland? So the key word is drove. What did St. Patrick say when he drove the snakes out of Ireland? Are you all right there in the back, fellas? No, I had to say it again because I didn't understand it at all. But because he was driving, apparently. Driving, and the snakes were in the car. So I had to have it spelled out to me, which I was quite embarrassed about because it is, I thought, when I understood it, I thought it was really quite funny. I'm sharing it with you. So he drove the snakes out of Ireland, but that is a legend. But there were many authenticated miracles of healing which took place, and many acts of kindness and compassion and love. And that's how he converted people, by example. Not by telling them, you are wicked heathens, you are bad pagans, abandon your ridiculous ideas and worship the one true God and explain about the Trinity. A lot of his conversion was due to his example. The fact that he was kind, he was compassionate, he did many good deeds, and his prayers, he wrote books, and his prayers are still used today. St. Patrick's breastplate, you may have heard of. And we know where he's buried, in Downpatrick Cathedral, and anywhere in Ireland associated with Patrick became a place of pilgrimage. And some of you will probably have been on pilgrimage and seen these places. And Patrick, of course, became a very popular Christian name, and anywhere associated with him. So he's one of the very well-known saints, and he's one of the earliest of the Christian missionaries to have such a great success and convert the Irish. And then we move to St. Columba. Now, interestingly, Columba means dove in Latin, but he was anything but a dove. Dove suggests gentle, and the symbol of peace, and doves are not aggressive. They don't eat meat, they eat seeds. They're gentle birds, doves. Pigeons maybe not so much, but doves are supposed to be a symbol of gentle behavior. But St. Columba was actually, at the time, described as being like an eagle. And eagles and doves couldn't be really more different from each other. It's sort of complete contrast that he looked like an eagle. So we associate eagles with power and strength and possibly aggression. Many countries have an eagle as their symbol or emblem, like, well, certainly Imperial Russia, the Habsburgs, Poland. Many countries use an eagle to represent power. Or lions, like we had a lion. So Columba was a very, very interesting saint. He was born in Ireland, 521, so we're jumping on 100 years from Patrick. And he's identified with the little island of Iona. He arrived there with 12 followers and built a small church. and established a monastic community. So he's a Celtic saint, and he was a loner, as we shall find out, but he did live in a monastic community, but it was a small community. Been quite a lot of interest in what kind of monasteries these were. Were they, some people have said, well, there was a stone church and then a lot of little huts with thatched roofs, you know, little wooden huts with thatched roofs. But archaeology has shown that they were building in stone, interestingly, because everyone thought that the Saxons didn't know anything about building in stone. They found the foundations of huts, which indicate that certainly the foundations were made of stone. They had a basis of stone. Maybe then they put wood on top of the stone, but they weren't as primitive as it used to be believed. And so he had established a monastery, and his personal mission, again, led by visions and this kind of insights that many of the Celtic missionaries had, to convert the heathen Scots and also Northumbria. He was of royal blood. He was connected to the Irish king Neil. I don't know whether I'm saying that correctly. He left Ireland in disgrace and went into self-appointed exile after refusing to hand over a copy of the Gospels he had illegally copied out. His family then declared war on the king, and following victory in battle, Columba felt so remorseful that he deliberately, as a kind of penance, decided to live somewhere where he couldn't see his native land. Hence, Iona. He couldn't see Ireland from Iona. This is typical of the Celtic saints, that they went in for dramatic acts of penance. He was famous for not liking cows or women. His argument was that where there were cows, there were women, because women normally milked cows. And that tradition continued, that we talk about milkmaids. It was a kind of inferior, seen as an inferior farming activity, that men didn't do that, women did it. So he said where there were cows, there would be women, and women were temptation. And that's right, the original monks, the original the time of St. Anthony, had gone into the desert to get away from temptation. So, and that continued, of course, that they'd taken vows of celibacy, lifelong celibacy, and so women were a temptation, and that is totally understandable. If you just say you didn't like cows or women, it sounds ridiculous. But then when it's explained, it doesn't sound so ridiculous at all. Iona, as many of you will know, probably many of you have visited Iona, I haven't, but many of you will have done, became famous for craftsmanship of various kinds, beautiful carvings, Celtic crosses, which were used as well, if they converted a village or the area around a village, then they would eventually give them a Celtic cross, and it was used as a preaching area in good weather, and sometimes not even in good weather. Before they could build a church, it was a rallying point, if you like. It was where people met to hear preaching, or where miracles would take place. It was a marker. This area is now Christian. And we all know how beautiful Celtic crosses are, and they're still copied today because the design is so lovely. Very complex. And just occasionally you see a hint of paganism. There are one or two, I can't think now which they are, and I should have researched it. There are one or two Celtic crosses that have got a bit of a mixture. They've got dragons and things which are pagan. And some of the carvings look as though they're pagan gods or pagan symbols. And then a picture of Christ on the cross. So they're still, the people are still sort of hedging their bets a little bit, like we talked about last time. They're still not quite sure that they want to go completely over to Christianity, lest their ancient gods are angry. And I think that is totally understandable when people are relying on the harvest to feed their families. I don't think we have any concept of what that must be like. I mean, it's true of millions and billions of people all over the world that rely totally on growing their own food. If the harvest fails, if there are floods or an earthquake or a volcanic explosion or something awful happens, then they will starve. And so it's very understandable that people would be nervous of abandoning the gods of weather, the gods of the harvest, goddesses sometimes. They were hedging their bets. They were thinking, I mean, this happened several times in the course of the story of Christianity spreading in this country, that there were setbacks, people reverted in times of difficulty or famine or plague and pestilence. Oh, we've offended the ancient gods, we'd better return to them. So it wasn't just smooth, it wasn't just like we perhaps learned at school, and it was just a success story and Christianity just spread and spread and it was all wonderful. Not at all. Of course our ancestors were afraid. We would be if we were growing our own food and living a totally rural life, depending on nature, looking at the sky all the time, seeing what the weather was doing. And then if things went horribly wrong, weather-wise, or in some other regard, then thinking we'd better return to the old gods because this has gone awfully wrong. And to be fair to our ancestors, they weren't just ridiculous and superstitious, which were perhaps told at school, you know, how people in the past were stupid and we're very advanced and wonderful. I think I was taught like that, you know, in the olden days, people were stupid before technology, before science and so on, stupid and rather superstitious and believed 10 ridiculous things before breakfast. And that is a risk, of course, that we think like that. But looking at it rationally, of course they were nervous. They had changed their faith. They'd taken a leap into the unknown. And the missionaries, again, to be fair, the missionaries often used success in battle to say, you were successful because you were now worshipping the true God. He helped you to succeed. He made you succeed, which is a dangerous way of preaching. Because then if anything goes wrong, they're going to switch back to the gods that they're used to, their traditional gods that they've trusted for generations. I mean, this happened with the conversion of the Roman emperors. It's dangerous to say you won this battle because you put the Chi-Rho sign on your helmet, which is what happened to the Emperor Constantine. He put a Christian symbol on his helmet, the helmets of his Roman troops, and they won a great battle. And then the missionaries were saying, well, that's because that's what you did. You need to turn totally Christian now because look how successful you were. Very dangerous idea to preach in that way. Tempting, but not satisfactory, obviously, because how are you going to explain a famine, pestilence, or a defeat in battle? It works both ways, doesn't it? And then what are you going to say? So, Columba was known for his amazing stamina, which is why he was described as being like an eagle. He was tall, thin, because of his lifestyle. He walked incredible distances, sleeping rough, eating roots and berries, as we've said, sometimes even eating grass. Looking like an eagle, and again, doing many good deeds, working miracles, and refusing gifts. This was true of all the Celtic monks, that they were, as they became more famous, people said, you don't want to walk everywhere, I'll give you a horse or a donkey. And they promptly gave it to somebody else. Or somebody would give them what we call a food parcel. They would give it to somebody else. That was their way of actively showing what Christianity was like, what the true meaning of Christianity, of generosity, and living humbly, and not wanting to be a personality, not what we'd say a celebrity. They were very anxious not to be seen as celebrities, to live humbly as Christ had done and walk everywhere as they believed Jesus had done. And so there's several examples of rich people saying, oh, you know, I'll give you a horse. You don't want to be walking everywhere. Yes, they did want to walk. Columba particularly was famous for these long walks that he did, and his conversion rate was apparently quite phenomenal. And he died in 597 AD in Iona. And Columba, of course, as I said, Columba's in Sutton, his name is remembered. Then St. Aidan, again, quite a lot of churches dedicated to St. Aidan. Irish, he's the one that's famous for founding the monastery at Lindisfarne, at the request of King Oswald of Northumbria, who had become a convert, he'd become a Christian. And he preached, Aidan preached to the rich and the poor, and he was responsible for funding and establishing churches, monasteries and schools. So this is very important. It's the beginning of a great flourishing of learning and illustrating beautiful manuscripts and so on. It was already happening in Iona, particularly in Lindisfarne. We've got the fantastic Lindisfarne Gospels, which are absolutely amazing, one of our great national treasures. So King Oswald actually became a saint, became Saint Oswald, the King of Northumbria, working in association with Aidan. And King Oswald was very generous. He kept giving Aidan and the monks gifts because that's what he felt he should do as a good Christian. They were promptly handed over to other people, which made him very frustrated. Horses, money, food, gifts for the monastery to make them more comfortable, pillows, nice, proper bedding. No, we live in a very austere way. So that was characteristic of the Celtic monks, that they were austere. They didn't believe in wealth. They believed in sort of an early form of communism. No, if they were given anything, they must share it, they must give it away. That's what Christianity was all about. Miracles took place. Aidan became more and more famous. The great miracle of rescue was when King Penda of Mercia, who you probably did learn about at school, Mercia, which we're in Mercia, Mercia was the aggressive Middle Kingdom. And at one stage, they were going along very well, becoming converted. And then King Penda came along, who was an ardent pagan, heathen worshipper. And Christianity sort of died in Mercia, pretty much, while King Penda was king. And he was also seeking to expand his kingdom and take over the others. So very, very aggressive. Set fire to Bramborough town, and Aidan, who was in retreat on Lindisfarne, prayed fervently to God. And this is in Bede's book, that he prayed fervently. And the wind suddenly changed, and the town was saved, as if really by miracle, that the wind was blowing all in one direction and fanning the flames, burning the town. And then they prayed, and the wind dramatically changed. And when you hear those sort of stories, you do think, well, no wonder people thought this man was a miracle worker. And then we've got Cuthbert. I'm very fond of Cuthbert because I wanted to go to Durham University. I set my heart on it. And Cuthbert, of course, is buried in the cathedral, in Durham Cathedral. I had a disastrous interview at Durham.
It still hurts.
Yeah, it does still hurt. It does still hurt. Martin said it still hurts. It does. I got the grades I needed, but that was afterwards, of course. You go for your interview long before you do the exam. So this is a bit of a diversion, but I'll just share it with you. a friend and I, she'd applied for a place to read geography at Durham. And I just thought about Durham because I've been as a tourist from Leeds. It's not that far up to Durham. That's where I'm from Leeds. And I'd been up to Durham and just fallen in love with it because it was old and wonderful, and there was a castle and a cathedral, and that's where St Cuthbert is buried, and where Bede, of course, the great historian Bede, is buried there as well. So I'd really set my heart on going to Durham for some good reasons, and also for some rather superficial reasons, like the undergraduates there were allowed to wear an undergraduate gown, and I rather imagined myself sort of swishing about in an undergraduate gown. A ridiculous reason for wanting to go somewhere. Anyway, it was bitterly cold in Leeds when my friend Irene and I set out on this journey by train up to Durham for our interviews. Bitterly cold, really, really awful. So I was dressed up like Nanook of the North, with a big coat and a big scarf, and I think I had a hat as well. Anyway, big gloves and boots, big winter boots with fur linings. We got on the train in Durham, and it was February. It was beautiful. The sun was out. It was mild. People were walking around virtually in shirt sleeves, and my friend and I just felt absolutely ridiculous. And at the age of 18, it's very easy to feel ridiculous if you're. It's kind of disconcerting not to be wearing the right things. And we both got quite hot and bothered, and we took our coats off and put them over our arms, but we were wearing lots of stuff underneath as well because it was so cold in Leeds, and we thought it would be even colder in Durham because it's further north. Anyway, that kind of threw my confidence. Also, we had to be interviewed for each college that we'd applied to because it's collegiate, like Oxford and Cambridge. So you ended up having 4 interviews, three college interviews for the 3 colleges you applied for, and then the important one with the history department or School of History. And each one ran late, so it got later and later. We were supposed to have our final interview at 2:30, and it was actually 4 o'clock. By which time, pretty tired, and I just had a disastrous interview. I knew after about 5 minutes, I'm ruining this. I've blown it. We weren't prepared. We prepared. Well, we did when I was teaching anyway, and I know now. Children are prepared for interviews. They have mock interviews and they're asked questions, and we didn't do that. So some of the questions I just hadn't prepared for, didn't know what they were going to ask, and was thrown. But it was really because I so much wanted to go there. All was well. My daughter went there, and I realised when she went how it had still rankled that I went to Birmingham University instead of Durham University. And so when she got the place, that feeling that I'd been somehow cheated went. And I used to go and visit and just think I'd died and gone to heaven. That she was there, and really did took advantage of it probably more than I would have done. So, but I've always had this not love, but liking for St Cuthbert, because I thought he was quite special. Born in Dunbar to a poor family, and again, tended sheep. There's quite a strong sheep theme. And he saw a vision of St Aidan being taken up into heaven by angels. So another vision. He became a monk at Melrose Abbey. So he was Scottish by birth and tradition. He then had to do military service because of this situation with Mercia being so aggressive, the Kingdom of Mercia being a very aggressive state. He had to do military service, interestingly, because of the situation between Northumbria and Mercia. Mercia was making inroads, trying to take over the Kingdom of Northumbria. And he then returned to his monastic life, briefly transferred to Ripon Abbey. The thing about St Cuthbert was that he was extremely promising in every way. You might say today, using modern phrase, that he was headhunted. And all he wanted was to be a kind of hermit missionary. He wanted to be a loner. He wanted to work in his own way. He didn't particularly, and he certainly didn't want celebrity. He certainly didn't want to be, he didn't really want to be a bishop. He didn't want to be an abbot. He wanted to serve. He wanted to be a servant. He was humble. And that's what's likable about Cuthbert, that people kept trusting responsibility upon him because he was very talented and very capable. And he kept turning opportunities down, which is sort of unusual nowadays. Being headhunted and then saying, no, thank you. I want to do things my way. So he was offered various positions, which he turned down, and then it was put to him, well, God wants you to have these particular jobs. So he went to Ripon, then he went back to Melrose. He was then sent as prior to Lindisfarne as a missionary and evangelist. And then in 676 AD, he asked permission to retire to a remote island. That's what he really wanted. He wanted to be worship in his own way, follow God in his own way, and dedicate his life to God through austerity, prayer, and contemplation. He hated publicity. He hated the idea that he was becoming famous, and he wanted to live close to nature. So this is another fascinating thing about the Celtic saints, that they were able to link back with not exactly nature gods, but they did live close to nature because of their lifestyle of living rough and walking for many miles in the open and sleeping rough, just wrapped up in their cloak. They had a very strong affinity and a very strong love of nature. And that was quite helpful when they were preaching, because they were able to understand the pagan love of nature and living things, whereas the Roman monks, not so much. And certainly Cuthbert is famous, and they're legends, but they stand the test of time. They sound quite convincing because he lived alone, and because he loved animals and birds. And it's a bit like St. Francis of Assisi preaching to the birds and the animals. A slight exaggeration of somebody who had an affinity, somebody who had a love of animals, and animals returning that love and respect and becoming tame. Because animals will, if somebody's living among them, they will accept them. They will accept a human being. Their natural instinct is to be afraid, but if somebody's living sort of among the animals, they will then, as we know, trust and almost love that person. And that's what happened with Cuthbert. There are two famous legends. One is about eider ducks, that while he was on Lindisfarne, one of the things he did as a penance, you can't help thinking, well, what sins is he committing that he needs to be so contrite and he needs to do a penance? One of the penances was to walk into the sea, which was cold, of course, and stand up to his neck in the sea. Some people said up to his waist, but it doesn't really matter, to be freezing cold anyway. And that when he came out, of course, he was wet and cold, and he didn't have any towels. He just waited till he got dry. I was wondering he didn't get pneumonia. And that the eider ducks plucked their feathers and to give him a comfortable place to lie. And we now talk about eider downs, because they used eider ducks' feathers for eider downs. So this idea that the birds felt sorry for him because he was cold. And the other lovely idea, the other lovely legend, is that the seals saw what he was doing, walking into the sea and standing there until he nearly, as a penance, until he was nearly unconscious with cold. Then he came out, and they'd been sunning them, or lying on rocks, and they were dry. They came and sat on his feet and warmed him, which I think is a lovely, lovely idea. And people have scoffed at it and said, oh no, seals wouldn't do that. But they have actually discovered that seals will do things like that. Accepting him as a fellow seal because he'd lived such a simple life, and they saw him every day, And I think those are two lovely legends which probably have some factual background. I don't think they are complete legends. They sound quite convincing. And of course, these monks were vegetarian, and they had a deep respect for wildlife, far more than the Roman monks. I don't mean that the Roman monks were bad people, not at all, but they hadn't had that same experience of living with nature and among wild creatures. Then it was felt that Cuthbert really was wasting his gifts, living in this way, being a loner, being a kind of hermit. And he was elected bishop of Lindisfarne. He was really quite indignant about it. He didn't want to be a bishop. He didn't want to be important. He loved his isolated life, but eventually he gave in. He decided, well, Christ was obedient, and therefore he must be. Well, it went against the grain. He died 687 AD in Lindisfarne. He's buried there, and then after 11 years, his body was exhumed because of the Viking raids. We're into the next period of history when, ironically, the Anglo-Saxons have now been converted. They have calmed down. They're not fierce warriors anymore. And then they have the experience of fierce warriors, pagan warriors, attacking this country as they had done centuries before. The Vikings, the Norsemen came, and the first places they attacked were monasteries. The first Viking raid was on Lindisfarne. Rumour had it that there were rather stupid men who didn't carry weapons, and that the church had many rich possessions like crucifixes and candlesticks. Well, I didn't really know what those were, but they knew that there were treasures available, and that the men who lived there, for some weird and wonderful reason, didn't carry weapons and wouldn't defend themselves, and wouldn't be able to defend the sacristy with all these fine things made of gold and silver. So the first attack was on a monastery, Lindisfarne. So the monks decided that Cuthbert's body was so precious they must rescue it. So they dug him up and put him in a coffin and kept moving around with the coffin for 7 years. Their most precious possession was Cuthbert's body, because many miracles had taken place. It had become what later became known as a shrine, but now it was a peripatetic shrine. And they didn't know where they were going to end up burying him. They kept looking for somewhere, and then there'd be a Viking raid, and they'd move on. And eventually, again, because of a vision, they were told by God to look for a certain sign, a dun cow. And they found a dun cow, and that turned into Durham Cathedral. And that's where Cuthbert was finally laid to rest. And in keeping with his modesty and his humble demeanor and his wish to be a servant of God, not anybody important, his tombstone is totally simple, and all it says on it is Cuthbertus. It's brilliant. So if you ever go to Durham, if you go to the cathedral, that's one of the not the show place, but a very, very important area, which is sort of sectioned off. And you can see Bede, great historian Bede, Saxon historian, and Cuthbertus. They're buried there. So that's why Durham Cathedral became famous as a shrine. And when the tomb was opened, and I should have researched this, but for family reasons I didn't, but when the tomb was opened and investigated, they found King, now Saint Oswald's head, mummified head, and lots of lovely things like a prayer book, and famously Cuthbert's pectoral cross, which is garneted very much like the Sutton Hoo treasure. They found various, and also a sort of scarf that he'd worn, which with embroidery on them, and wonderful things found in his tomb, wonderful things from the point of view of archaeology. So Cuthbert is a very wonderful and special saint, and because of his modesty and his desire to have a simple life, living alongside and hand in hand with nature, almost kind of Hindu idea that you mustn't kill. I mean, obviously they none of them ate meat, none of the monks of either persuasion ate meat. They're all vegetarian. But he was even worried about eating plants. He sort of totally loved nature, which fits into today. That he was an early ecologist. Then the Synod of Whitby, very interesting. Finally, because of the success of the Celtic monks and the success of the Roman monks, the Roman missionaries, well, say missionaries. At first, it didn't matter that they were teaching slightly differently and had a different organization, etc. It didn't matter because they weren't in contact. But then, famously, it became an issue. King Oswiu, King of Northumbria, became a Christian, converted by the Irish. Sometimes that's a shorthand way of saying the Celtic monks, the Celtic missionaries, Irish missionaries, although they weren't all Irish. And his wife was a Christian following the Roman tradition. She'd been converted by monks working from the Vatican, working from Rome. Anyway, well, so what? Doesn't matter. Well, it did. The Celtic, the issue wasn't the only issue, but the main issue was the dating of Easter. And the dating of Easter was calculated. I won't go into detail because I never really understood how to calculate Easter anyway. So there were two different ways anyway of calculating the date of Easter, Easter Sunday and Easter week. And obviously then Good Friday, you know, the whole of the center of Christianity. It mattered very much that they were being celebrated a week apart. So that the king was celebrating Easter Sunday, celebrating with feasts. His wife was fasting, the queen was fasting because according to her calendar, she was a week behind. She was observing Palm Sunday, coming up to Good Friday. Her entourage, she herself and her entourage, were fasting. So it became a serious issue. People didn't know what the people at court, at that court in Northumbria, didn't know what to do. There were other issues which are minor by comparison. The whole organizational thing was becoming a bit of an issue. You know, the Celtic monks being kind of a bit maverick, individualistic, doing their own thing, and the Roman tradition being, we obey the Pope. The Pope gives the orders. We all agree. We are obedient to the Pope, and that's where the organization is centered, in Rome. And the other sounds very trivial, but it was just the way that the monks indicated that they were monks, how they had their, it was called a tonsure, how they had their hair changed. I mean, some people got a natural tonsure because they've lost their hair.
Thank you, Judy.
Natural. Mostly they were young men. The recruits for the monasteries were young. So to indicate that they had dedicated their lives to Christ, they'd taken the 3 vows: obedience, poverty, and celibacy. The Roman monks shaved the middle of their head to represent what was left. The hair round then was represented the crown of thorns. It was symbolic. So you took all the hair out of the middle of your head and left a fringe all the way around, and that was the crown of thorns. The Celtic monks, there's even disagreement about this. Some historians saying they shaved up the back of their heads, and some people saying they did a whole sweep through from the front right down to the back, but kept their side hair. So it sounds very trivial and superficial and not important, but it became an issue. but mainly it was the date of Easter. And then we've got this lovely person called St. Hild, or Hilda of Whitby, an abbess. Now, by this time, we're into the 7th century, and there were joint monasteries, a bit like a school where they're not co-ed, but there's a boys' school and a girls' school alongside each other. So Whitby Abbey was unusual because it's got men, monks, and women, nuns, living in the same area. Obviously, having taken vows of celibacy, but interesting that it was ahead of its time, you might say. The abbess, Hilda, was asked to host what we now call a conference, and we still use the word synod. It's called the Synod of Whitby. It was decided that they must have it was like a religious summit conference. They must sort out this business of Easter. That was the top item on the agenda. Sort it out. And Bishop Wilfrid of Ripon, who was a very, very powerful personality, represented the Roman tradition, and various Celtic missionaries spoke on their own behalf. And there was a lot of arguing, it has to be said. It didn't fall into place. Both sides passionately held to their own opinions. And then Bishop Wilfrid made a powerful speech, you might say, like a sermon, and he pointed out that St. Peter was obviously the Roman tradition, St. Peter himself, and that he guarded the gates of heaven. He had the keys, what we call the pearly gates. He had the keys to heaven. And supposing people of the Celtic tradition, who had been converted by Celtic missionaries, or the Irish missionaries they were being called, got to heaven, and St. Peter said, sorry, you can't come in. And this made everybody think very seriously about the situation, because they hadn't quite thought of it that way. It was like a bit of a power struggle going on. But Wilfrid suddenly had this idea of making it into a sort of realistic situation. Supposing you're refused access to heaven. Oh. So King Oswiu decided to favour the Roman form of Christianity. He did the honourable thing and gave in. I mean, there was an issue because it was his wife's tradition. So it's like a man very generously agreeing that his wife was right. But thank goodness he did, because this was a turning point, a real turning point in our history, that we became part of European Christendom. We accepted that the Pope was, Pope was the boss, the Pope was in charge. We fell into line with the rest of Christendom. It didn't happen overnight. Some of the Celtic monks were very upset about this and went off and continued to do their own thing. Some of them sort of sulked and you know, it wasn't a done deal. I mean, we were taught at school, if we were taught this at all, that it was brilliant. I'll just finish by saying another snake story. Snakes are seen as evil because obviously others, vipers, bite people and they possibly die. And also because of snakes, snakes are also serpents, and because of the serpent in the story of Adam and Eve. The serpent represented evil, represented the devil, Satan. So another snake story. Abbess Hild, or Hilda, we put an A on the end, Hilda of Whitby is credited with having destroyed snakes, which were rampaging around the monastery and biting people and killing them, and that she drove them to the edge of the cliff. If you know Whitby, the abbey is on the top of a quite big, large cliff. That she drove the snakes, not like St. Patrick in a car, she drove the snakes to the edge of the cliff, and then they fell off the cliff, and she cursed them. So they curled up and they landed on the beach and they turned to stone. Now, what is being referred to, of course, is the fact that this is part of the Jurassic coast, and they're ammonites. They do look like curled up snakes, but they're actually ancient cuttlefish. The fish bit's gone, and the shell bit has fossilized. And when I was little, I didn't know whether I wanted to be a geologist or an Egyptologist or an archaeologist or a history teacher. And we used to have holidays, my mum and I, while my father was off on one of it more called his birding holidays, because he was a bird
Twitcher.
Oh no, Martin, not a twitcher.
Oh.
Oh no, he hated twitchers. No, he's a bird photographer and expert. So he went off with birding friends to do photographing birds. No, not twitcher. And my mother and I went on holiday often to Whitby, because Whitby was so lovely then. It's changed. It's still lovely, but it was a fishing. The trawlers were still there in Whitby. And I learned to absolutely love the Abbey. We went every time we went to Whitby, we climbed up to the Abbey. And I just loved these ammonites because you could actually get them on the beach. So when we arrived in Whitby, we either took screwdrivers with us. I'll explain now in a minute why screwdrivers, or we bought them from Woolworths in Whitby. I remember that when I was little, going into Woolworths and buying about 3 different kinds of screwdrivers. We then went down to the beach, and I'd learned from my granddad's books, the Harmsworth History of the World, about ammonites, that they were fossils and that they were many, well, wonderfully old, millions and millions of years old. And that they were there on the beach, but concealed. And that if you knew where to look and you used your screwdriver properly, you could prise open the stones that you found that looked like rather flat pebbles lying about on the beach. And if you knew what to look for, there was a kind of zigzag line round this, what looked like a pebble. There was an ammonite inside it. And if you could get the screwdriver somehow into this zigzag and push really hard, you might be able to split it open, and inside would be the ammonite and its impression. And oh joy, my mother and I found several. And we always took a basket with us, and we put our ammonites in the basket. But you can buy them in Whitby. A lot of you probably have been to Whitby. People go on the beach and they find the ammonites, and they sometimes polish them, and sometimes they cleave them, sometimes they chop them, and then they polish them. And you can get them in the shops. You can get Whitby jet and ammonites, but we like to find our own. So I've always admired Hilda of Whitby, because she was accredited, like St. Patrick, of cleaning out the snakes. But in fact, what people had done was just find the ammonites and think, oh, these look like snakes that have turned to stone. Our abbess did that because she was so holy. Drove the snakes out and turned them to stone as a miracle. And there's a picture of her. Martin's found this brilliant picture.
Hello.
Of Hild and the ammonites at her feet.
Back in a minute, I'm doing a lecture. Yeah.
So
Hi.
that's absolute. So next time we're going to do Vikings and what happened when the Vikings invaded, how it damaged, damaged the economy, obviously. What happened, and then we will do about King Alfred, who was the great leader and in the great fight against the Vikings. So we'll do Vikings next time. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy.